She was the only woman in Harding County who had to check whether a seat was empty before she sat down in it, not because of pride, but because people had started standing up when she approached. It was the 4th of July, 1883. The whole town of Bitter Creek, Montana, had turned out for the Independence Day picnic on the square, the way they did every year, red bunting draped along the fence posts, children chasing each other through the legs of adults, the smell of smoked pork ribs and fresh-baked cornbread drifting from the long tables set up in front of the courthouse. It was the kind of afternoon that was supposed to feel like something, like belonging somewhere, like being part of a thing larger than yourself. Maggie Holt stood at the edge of it all with a plate she hadn't touched. She was 24 years old, and she had learned in the past 8 months that grief and accusation together create a particular kind of loneliness, one that follows you into crowds rather than disappearing from them. Her late husband, Daniel Holt, had been the company physician for the Consolidated Copper Works on the North Ridge. Quiet, careful Daniel, who had kept meticulous records and double-checked every dosage and never once raised his voice in the 12 years she had known him. 6 months ago, 17 miners had fallen violently ill over the course of a single week. 3 of them had died. The company's investigation, conducted by its own men, concluded that the source of the poisoning was a contaminated medicine supply, specifically a tonic Daniel had dispensed from his surgery the month prior. Daniel had died before the report was even finished. A stroke, the doctor from Billings said when they brought him in from the cold. Maggie had held his hand through 2 nights and watched the light go out of him. And then she had buried him. And then the report had arrived. The town had made up its mind quickly after that. She stood near the far edge of the picnic table now, beside the choker tree preserve and a plate of corn someone had already picked through because it was the least populated end. Mrs. Rutherford, wife of the mine foreman, was seated about 4 feet to her left, and she had not spoken a word to Maggie, had in fact shifted her chair an inch to the right since Maggie arrived. Maggie noticed. She always noticed now. She had developed a sensitivity to small rejections the way some people develop a sensitivity to cold, an ache that started deep and radiated outward. She was staring at a knot in the pine of the tabletop, willing herself to eat something when the noise around her changed. Not gradually, all at once, a ripple moving through the crowd the way wind moves through tall grass, turning heads in a single direction. The laughter near the courthouse steps faltered, the children stopped running. Somewhere, a tin cup was set down with a quiet, deliberate click. Maggie looked up. He was standing at the edge of the square, where the dirt road came down off the North Ridge. He was not a small man. He was the kind of man who made you recalibrate the space around him. Broad, through the shoulders, weathered in the way that comes from years of outdoor work rather than from age, with a beard going gray at the edges and hands that looked like they had been used hard and often. His coat was heavy canvas and road dusty. His boots were caked with dried clay from the mountain trail, and he carried a canvas pack over one shoulder like he had walked a long way and intended to walk further. His name was Reid Calloway. Maggie did not know this yet. He stood there for a moment, reading the square the way a man reads terrain, measuring exits and distances and what was where. His eyes moved across the crowd, taking in the mayor's table at the center, the mine company men clustered under the oak tree, the church women arranged near the dessert table like a wall of goodwill and disapproval. And then his gaze traveled to the far end, the quiet, picked-over end, and it found Maggie. He walked toward her. The crowd parted with the particular nervousness people reserve for things they don't understand. He did not acknowledge the mayor. He did not stop when Rutherford, the mine foreman, stepped slightly into his path. He walked the full length of the square and stopped at the empty stretch of bench to Maggie's right, the gap that everyone had been careful not to fill. He set his pack down on the ground. He looked at her directly, the way very few people had in months. "Mind if I sit?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to carry. Maggie stared at him. You know who I am, she said. It wasn't a question. In a town of 800 people, everyone knew. I know your name is Maggie Holt, he said, and I know you make room when someone asks politely. He gestured at the space beside her. She moved her plate 2 inches to the left, which was all the answer either of them needed. He sat. He reached across her without ceremony and pulled the cornbread basket closer, broke off a piece, and began to eat with the comfortable efficiency of a man who had not been particular about meal settings for a long time. Maggie watched him for a moment. Around them, the picnic had resumed, but at a different frequency. People talking in lower voices, casting glances, Mrs. Rutherford now sitting very still. You're going to ruin your reputation, Maggie said quietly. He chewed, swallowed, looked at her without alarm. I've been ruining my reputation since 1871. I'm practiced at it. They think my husband poisoned those miners. I know what they think. And he looked at her steadily. And I came down off that ridge with something that says otherwise. But that conversation's better had somewhere private. He tilted his head slightly toward the watching crowd. Eat your food first. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you run. She looked down at her plate. Something in her chest, wound tight for 8 months, shifted a fraction of an inch. She picked up her fork. For the rest of the afternoon, Reid Calloway sat beside her and ate 2 full plates of food and spoke only when she spoke first, which she eventually did. He answered her questions in the same short, direct manner. He was a land surveyor, or had been, before he started doing freelance essay work for mining operations throughout the territory. He had come to Bitter Creek 6 weeks ago to survey a section of the North Ridge for a potential new shaft. He'd been camping up there since. He did not explain why he had sat down beside her. She did not ask again. Some things were clear enough without explaining. The morning after the picnic, Maggie was in her yard splitting firewood, a task she had gotten competent at out of necessity, when she heard boots on the gravel behind the gate. She turned with the axe still in her hands, which she suspected was not a bad way to receive unexpected visitors. It was Reid. He was leading a mule loaded with canvas bags and a wooden crate strapped with rope, and he was carrying, tucked under one arm, a tin that smelled unmistakably of coffee. I've found something up on the ridge, he said, without preamble. I've been sitting on it, trying to decide what to do with it. After yesterday, I decided. He held up the tin. We should talk inside. She considered him for a moment, a stranger, a mule, a crate, and coffee. She decided that a man who thought to bring coffee when delivering serious news had at least some basic competency. Gate's not locked, she said. Inside, she put water on for the coffee, and Reid set the crate on her kitchen table. He opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in oilskin cloth, were 3 things: a glass medicine bottle with a faded label, a folded piece of paper, and a leather-bound ledger, small and thin, the kind used for field notes. 6 weeks ago, Reid said, I was surveying the north face of the ridge, up above the old number 4 shaft, the one they closed 3 years back. I found a cache under a rock shelf. Someone had put it there deliberately, hidden it. He unwrapped the bottle first. This is labeled as copper sulfate solution. It's what the company used in the leaching process up there, but it's also what those men were sickened with. The symptoms matched a copper sulfate poisoning exactly. I looked it up in Billings. Maggie stared at the bottle. Daniel dispensed iron tonic, she said carefully. Not copper sulfate. I know. Reid unfolded the paper. It was a dispensing order on company letterhead, signed and dated. The date was 2 weeks before the miners fell ill. The signature at the bottom belonged to the company's operations manager, a man named Hector Greer. Below it, in different handwriting, was a note. Substitution authorized. Source untraceable. Someone ordered copper sulfate added to a batch of tonic supply before it ever reached your husband's surgery. Your husband dispensed what he was given. He had no way of knowing the supply had been tampered with. Maggie felt the room tilt slightly. She put both hands flat on the table. "There's more," Reid said, not unkindly. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with small, precise entries, dates, quantities, dollar amounts. "This is a record of payments from the Consolidated Copper Works to a private account. The amounts start small, $10 here, 20 there, and then about 4 months before the poisoning, they jump. Significantly." He pointed to an entry. The name beside the account was not Greer's. It was the name of Sheriff Burton Alcott. Maggie read it twice. Then she sat down in the kitchen chair because her legs had made that decision for her. "Alcott," she said. "He's been on the company payroll for at least 2 years," Reid said. "My best guess, and it's not a bad guess, I've done this kind of work before, is that Greer ordered the substitution to cut costs on the tonic supply. Something went worse than they intended. People died, and Alcott helped them bury it. Blame had to land somewhere. Your husband was dead and couldn't defend himself." The silence in the kitchen was so complete that Maggie could hear the coffee beginning to bubble. "Who else knows you found this?" she asked. "Nobody." "How long has it been up there?" "Based on how weathered the oilskin was, at least 6 months. Someone hid it in a hurry and maybe intended to retrieve it later. Or never retrieve it. Hard to say." Maggie stared at the ledger. 8 months of lowered eyes and moved chairs and whispered words that stopped when she walked into a room. 8 months of wearing Daniel's ruined name like a brand. The anger that moved through her then was very quiet and very cold, which was, she would later understand, the most dangerous kind. "There's a federal land office in Helena," she said, "and a territorial marshal. Marshal's name is Henry Pruitt. I've worked with him before. He's competent." Reid paused. "Helena is 4 days north by road. Alcott controls the local deputies." "Yes." "And Greer has half the town council in his pocket." "Yes." "Then we can't go to anyone local." She stood up and went to the stove, poured the coffee into 2 tin cups with a steadiness that surprised her, and brought them back to the table. "How fast can we move?" Reid looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. A recalibration, like a man who had expected to have to convince someone of something and found the door already open. "I can have the mule ready in 2 hours," he said. "I'd suggest we leave before noon, before anyone wonders why there's a mule in your yard." They were on the north trail by midday, moving through stands of lodgepole pine, with the ridge rising steeply to the left and the valley falling away below them to the right. Maggie rode Daniel's old mare, who was steady-footed and unbothered by terrain, and Reid led the mule, who was neither, but managed. He knew the trails well, took them through a game path that cut 2 hours off the main road and kept them away from the eastern approach to town, where Alcott's deputy, Vern Cook, ran a loose patrol. They made 12 miles the first afternoon before Reid called a stop at a creek crossing where the horses could drink. "You should know," he said, filling the canteens, "that I knew Daniel." Maggie, who had been watering the mare, looked up. "Not well," Reid said. 2 years ago I was doing survey work near Copper Basin, and I caught a fever. Bad one. The company brought Daniel out to tend to me. He was doing rounds for the satellite camps that summer. He was there 2 days. He handed her a canteen. He was a careful man. He checked every dose twice and explained everything he was doing and why. I thought about that when the reports came out. It didn't fit." Maggie took the canteen. "Nobody wanted it to not fit," she said. "It was easier if it fit." "Most things are." They made camp that night in a shallow draw out of the wind, under a sky so crowded with stars that they seemed to press downward. Reid built a fire small and smokeless in the way of a man who had spent a long time not wanting to be found. Maggie sat across from it with her blanket around her shoulders and watched him work, and thought about Daniel checking every dose twice, and felt the grief and the anger living in her chest as separate creatures, the grief old and tired, the anger newly awake and hungry. "Why did you sit down beside me yesterday?" she asked. Reid poked the fire once, settled the wood. Because you were sitting alone and you weren't going to move, and I respected that. He glanced at her. And because I had been carrying what was in that crate for 6 weeks trying to decide if it was my business. When I saw the whole town eat their food 5 feet away from you, I decided it was. Maggie looked at the fire. You could have just given me the ledger and walked away. Could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment. Because whoever hid that cash had help. And whatever help they had has had 6 months to get comfortable with what they did. A woman alone, riding into Helena with a ledger and a bottle. She might not make it there. He looked at her directly. And I don't leave things half done. Maggie held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then looked back at the fire. Something she hadn't felt in a long time moved quietly through her, not yet named, but present. On the second afternoon, they came down out of the high timber onto the Foothills Road and rode into trouble wearing a badge. Deputy Vern Cook was waiting at the junction where the ridge trail met the Billings Road. Not pacing, not searching, but sitting on his horse in the particular way of a man who has been told exactly what to look for and has found it. 2 other men flanked him, not deputies, not in uniform. Hired work, Reid said quietly, without moving his lips. Maggie kept her face neutral. Maggie Holt, Cook said, walking his horse forward. Sheriff wants a word with you back in town. I'm sure he does, Maggie said. This isn't a request. I didn't hear a warrant mentioned. Cook's jaw tightened. He looked at Reid. Calloway, you're outside your business here. I'm a private citizen on a public road, Reid said pleasantly. I can't see where the problem is. The problem, Cook said, his voice dropping, is that the sheriff has information that Mrs. Holt is in possession of stolen property, company property. And what property is that? Maggie asked. Cook reached for something at his saddle. Reid moved first, not toward Cook, but sideways, putting himself and his mule between Maggie's mare and the 2 hired men on the right flank. His hand rested on the rifle stock in his saddle scabbard, not drawing it, just resting there. I think, Reid said calmly, that you should go back and tell Alcott that we're going to Helena to file a land survey report, which is my legal obligation, and not in any way his concern. And I think that if he decides to make it his concern, he should consider very carefully what happens when a territorial marshal starts looking into why a county sheriff is stopping civilians on public roads. Cook stared at him. The 2 hired men exchanged a look. Go back, Reid said, and something in his voice closed the conversation like a door. Cookie wheeled his horse and rode back east, the 2 men behind him. They didn't go quickly, which was a show of dignity, but they went. Maggie let out a slow breath. He'll send word ahead. I know. Reid turned his horse north. We push through tonight. They rode until nearly midnight, through cold that came off the mountains in waves and turned their breath to fog. Maggie's hands were numb inside her gloves, but she didn't complain, partly because Reid didn't, and partly because behind the discomfort was something that felt almost electric, the forward momentum of truth that had been held down for too long. On the 4th morning, Helena appeared in the valley below them like a rumor becoming real. Marshal Henry Pruitt's office was on the main street, a spare building with a federal seal on the door and a clerk who looked too young for the job. Pruitt himself was older than Maggie expected, compact and gray-haired with the unhurried manner of a man who had heard a great many urgent stories and learned to let them breathe before responding. He listened to everything without interrupting. He examined the bottle, the dispensing order, and the ledger with his reading glasses on and his hands flat on the desk. He asked 5 questions, all precise. Then he took the glasses off and set them down. Hector Greer and Burton Alcott, he said. Yes, Reid said. Pruitt looked at Maggie. Mrs. Holt, your husband's record with the medical board, is it clean? Completely, she said. He never had a complaint filed. Pruitt nodded slowly. He picked up the ledger again, studied the payment entries one more time. Then he set it down with the finality of a decision being made. I'll wire the district attorney in Billings this afternoon. I want a company auditor on the books by end of week." He looked at Maggie. "It's going to take time. These things always do. But what's in this ledger, if it holds up to scrutiny, and it looks like it will, this is enough." Maggie nodded. She had been holding herself very still since they sat down. Now something released, quietly and completely, and she felt suddenly exhausted in the deep-down way that only comes when you have been braced against something for a very long time and it finally lets go. 3 weeks later, federal deputies rode into Bitter Creek on a Wednesday morning. Hector Greer was at his desk at the company offices when they arrived, and he did not resist. He had the look of a man who had known for some time that the thing he had buried was moving upward through the ground. Sheriff Burton Alcott attempted to leave town the night before the deputies arrived, which was noted in the arrest report as consciousness of guilt. They found him 20 miles south on the Bozeman Road with a saddlebag containing a substantial amount of cash. The territorial newspaper ran the story with the detail that a company ledger, recovered by a freelance surveyor working the North Ridge, had provided the primary evidence. It did not mention Maggie's name. She read the story at a table in a Helena boarding house, with coffee going warm in her hands, and felt something she hadn't felt in nearly a year, the particular quiet of the thing that was over. Daniel's name was cleared formally, in writing, by the Bitter Creek Town Council 6 weeks after the arrests. The council sent a letter to Helena. Maggie did not go back to collect it in person. She sent a reply from Helena requesting it be filed with the county clerk, which it was. She did not go back to Bitter Creek at all. The house she and Reid rented outside Helena sat on a 1/4 acre with a kitchen garden and a view of the mountains from the back porch. It wasn't much, but it had good light in the mornings, and Reid had a habit of being up before dawn to start the fire, so the kitchen was warm by the time she came downstairs, which she had stopped pretending not to appreciate. She was standing on the back porch one October morning, watching frost melt off the garden beds, when she heard him come out behind her. He handed her a cup of coffee without a word and stood beside her looking at the mountains. "You could go back," he said after a while, "if you wanted. The name's clear now." "I know," she said. "But—" She thought about Mrs. Rutherford moving her chair, about the sound of the whole picnic going quiet, about checking the seat before she sat down. "Bitter Creek is what happened to me," she said. "This is where I'm going." Reid drank his coffee. The mountains were going pink at the top where the sun was just reaching them. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't need him to. Some understandings don't require words. They just require two people standing in the same place, looking at the same thing, and choosing to stay. "I keep thinking about the moment Maggie moved her plate 2 inches to the left. Not a word, not an explanation. Just that small, deliberate shift, making room for a man she didn't know, in a town that had decided she didn't deserve a place at the table at all. That 2 inches said everything she couldn't say out loud. I'm still here. I haven't broken. Come sit, if you mean it." What strikes me most about Maggie's story isn't the corruption, or the arrest, or even the ledger that blew the whole thing open. It's that she survived 8 months of being the town's answer to a question nobody wanted to ask honestly. 8 months of moved chairs and lowered voices and the particular cruelty of people who consider themselves decent, and she didn't become bitter. She became careful. There's a difference, and it matters more than people realize. The men who destroyed Daniel's name, Greer and Alcott, they made a calculation. They decided that a dead man and a grieving widow were easier to sacrifice than their own comfort. That's not just dishonesty. That's a specific kind of moral failure that starts small, in private, and then has to be defended publicly, louder and louder, until you're sending deputies down a public road to stop a woman from telling the truth. Every cover-up I've ever seen work that way. The wrongdoing isn't the hardest part to undo. It's all the decisions that came after it, each one building a wall around the first one, that make it so hard to get back to solid ground. Reid didn't have to do any of it. He could have left that oilskin cache under the rock shelf and surveyed his section and ridden back to wherever he came from, nobody would have known. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't require an audience. It requires that you know what you found, and that you sit with what it means, and that you decide you're not the kind of person who walks away from it. He carried that evidence for 6 weeks, turning it over in his mind, before he made his choice. 6 weeks is a long time to stay honest about what you know. And Maggie, what she showed me is that endurance isn't the same as passivity. She didn't survive that year by going quiet and small and waiting for someone to rescue her. She survived by refusing to pretend, by showing up to the picnic, by finishing her food, by knowing, somewhere underneath all that grief and exhaustion, that the truth had weight, and that weight would eventually land somewhere. When Reid handed her the ledger, she didn't fall apart. She asked how fast they could move. That kind of readiness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from 8 months of practice, of staying sharp when everything around you was trying to dull you down. What I take from all of this is simple, even if it isn't easy. The world has a way of sorting things out eventually, not through luck, not through fate, but through the accumulated pressure of what's actually true, pressing up against what's been constructed to hide it. It takes people like Reid who refuse to look away. It takes people like Maggie who refuse to disappear. And it takes a certain kind of stubborn faith, not in any particular doctrine or creed, but in the idea that what a person is made of shows up, sooner or later, in what they do when nobody's watching and the cost is real. Bitter Creek got it wrong. But Maggie didn't let Bitter Creek be the end of the story. That's the part worth remembering.